Meyer, founder and CEO of Amazon solutions provider Envision Horizon.
And I'm Todd Pachowski, Director of Performance Marketing at Envision Horizons. We've teamed up to make the Common Mistakes podcast.
Todd and I meet with business owners, leaders, and investors to discuss common mistakes and other business experiences they've learned from. Tune in every other Tuesday for your dose of business advice. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Common Mistakes, where we talk about mistakes that we've seen or made ourselves so that you don't have to learn the hard way. I'm Laura Meyer.
And I'm Todd Pachowski. Today we have the absolute pleasure of Taryn Jones Laeben joining us. Her career has been focused on empowering founder vision and unlocking hypergrowth for mission-driven companies. She is the former Chief Operating Officer of SoulCycle, the revolutionary indoor cycling brand founded in New York City in 2006. Before SoulCycle, she was the Chief Commercial Officer at Casper, the fastest growing sleep company, where she led expansion across retail, wholesale, partnerships, customer experience, and strategy at large. Prior to Casper, she spent many years generating industry-leading results in fashion and retail brands like Kate Spade New York. There, she led multi-channel growth across 120 plus retail stores, 500 points of wholesale distribution, and the e-commerce channel. She was a key member of the executive team that led Kate Spade New York to become the global lifestyle brand it is today. And capitalizing on her success as a seasoned executive and day-to-day operator, she founded an integrated advisory firm, IRL Partners. There, her and her team work with a select number of startups across the broader consumer and healthcare landscape, including Mirror, Parade, Real, and Daring. So Taryn, I'm out of breath reading that. Your resume and experience is outstanding, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks again for coming on.
Thank you for having me. I didn't write that bio. I would keep it complimentary of myself.
Well, we are just in awe of all that you've accomplished. And I know that you can't get to where you are today without a few bumps in the road. So I'm just going to kick off this conversation with what is a mistake you made, or maybe a few along the way, that in hindsight, you're very thankful for that experience because you just learned so much from it.
There are so many. You were taking me back actually as you were reading my resume to mistakes I made even before really the retail landscape became truly digital, and I was thinking about very tactical mistakes that happen when you're operating a bricks and mortar store fleet, but those are probably less interesting to the audience than some of the more recent ones. And I think the good news about the question is there's no shortage of answers. I think looking back at some of my more recent work over the past 5 or 6 years, which has really been around unlocking hypergrowth in early to mid-stage startups, and oftentimes in so doing, differentiating or expanding the channel mix and the distribution matrix. I reflected on that a bit in advance of knowing I was going to chat with you both today. And I thought it might be helpful to talk a little bit about kind of underestimating the complexity of moving a business from omni-channel DTC e-commerce to a multi-channel, multi-distribution format. And I think, it's a pretty germane topic right now, I think, for a lot of businesses that have originated in the DTC landscape with rising digital acquisition costs and increasing online competition and all the dynamics that we're all super familiar with and live with every day, as well as sort of the cost of offline distribution coming down and coming more in line, and oftentimes becoming more efficient than online distribution. So with sort of the opportunities that those shifts create for businesses to diversify, I thought it might be helpful to talk a little bit about mistakes and watch outs in that world. Just knowing that it's a very complex process, and one that I have a lot of lessons learned on across many companies, but over the past 5 or 6 years.
When brands are looking to take on more channels, where do you see most mistakes start? Like I can say from our experience, oftentimes we see it more on the logistics and the operational pieces, but curious to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, totally. I think moving a company from omni-channel to multi-channel, like first and foremost, and I think this was probably my biggest mistake or lesson learned when we did this at Casper, was underestimating what a holistic mindset shift it is for the organization. Having come from multi-channel and growing up in multi-channel at Kate Spade and in fashion, and then moving over to a DTC company, in hindsight, really underestimated how holistically we would have to shift the mindset of the organization to always be thinking in an omni-channel way. So, tactical example, but if a growth pod wanted to turn on a promotion around a pillow, for all sorts of good reasons, but suddenly we had pillows being sold in retail stores and in Target, and then the promotion just went up as an innocent and well-meaning test online. Suddenly it created a real issue because we were pricing our product differently in different channels. So really understanding that moving into a multi-channel environment requires like a holistic mindset shift of the entire company and all of the workflow streams that sort of stem from the overall strategy. And I think I underestimated how much education I would have to do more broadly around all of the potential implications and filters that we would have to sort of put on our business and our way of planning and implementing, such that we could think in an omni-channel way. So I think for me, like at a high level, that was probably the greatest learning. And it's maybe appropriate for the subject matter of this podcast, because it's like one of those things that's really hard to learn. And it's also really hard to solve for, because you can't sort of, we got there certainly at Casper through a lot of education and, lunch and learns and, connecting the dots for department leaders, but it was a bespoke solve. And I think in every organization, it kind of has to be a bespoke solve, because organizations are, structured and communicate differently. Each is a bit unique, but I think first and foremost, it's sort of like that understanding that you are going to have to go through like a holistic learning curve as a company, and the things that you're going to have to consider at every juncture need to then be consciously multi-channel.
And you mentioned having to maybe readjust some of the workflow streams and the communication internally, because this is something we also see ourselves, where with the more digitally native brands, they're used to being able to be native of like, if they have excess inventory on Amazon, great, let's just throw up a coupon. And then if they're also selling in Target, it can get complicated. So like, are there processes that you've seen to be successful when navigating and fixing some of these more workflows, or going from being a really nimble, flexible company to now having to get more approvals and kind of that more red tape type internal culture?
Yeah, I think I'll give you like a super tactical answer and then more of like a strategic answer. I think like a tactical hack for sort of like multi-channel promotions is I always say to teams, like, build like a 6-month promotional toolbox that contemplates all of your channels and all of like the best case all the way down to the worst case scenario. Best being like least promotional and worst being most promotional, because there are sometimes you gotta just do it. But getting really planful up front around, okay, these kinds of promotions, $20 off of our core product or whatever it is, can kind of be pulsed in any channel evergreen. And we never discount our subscription, for instance, if you're a hardware or software business, but maybe we'll discount it just for Black Friday across all of our channels. Or, this specific colorway we're only going to give to this channel because we know wholesale sometimes needs like more frequent markdowns. Therefore, we can mark down the purple, I'm making it up, and it won't impact any of our other channels. So like thinking really upfront across all of the different scenarios by channel and how you can pulse different sort of iterations across them. And I just call it I call it a promo toolbox. And like just revisiting that on a 6-month basis, taking into account, of course, like what's happening. Obviously, if it's the holiday time period, you're going to have to contemplate Black Friday into Cyber Monday, all the way, all the way through the holidays. So time of year and what's going on sort of promotionally, given that is also like this probably the third leg of that stool. It's like channel, tool, and then kind of the macro. So that is a really tactical answer. I think the strategic answer really lies in organizational design and way of working once you move from mono-channel to multi-channel. So being really thoughtful around, okay, is our merchant team going to be, if you're a SKU heavy, product heavy, physical product heavy business, is our merchant team going to span all channels and therefore be contemplating, the needs for our own business as well as our Amazon business as well as our Target business? Is our marketing team going to be organized by distribution channel, or are we going to be organized by subject matter expertise? So thinking about the organizational design, but then also next to that, what are the pods that need to come together cross-functionally on a rolling basis to make those decisions? So for instance, if there's a growth pod and that growth pod is the person who oversees wholesale, the person who oversees conversion and essentially revenue on your own site, and then perhaps your offline retail business, what are the 5 things that they need to align on a rolling basis weekly, such that one channel isn't cannibalizing another? Because of course, like at the end of the day, the name of the game here is expansion, so that like all boats rise. If you get into a situation where your channels are cannibalizing each other, it's such an unfortunate kind of outcome when really they ought to sort of all be complementary and accretive to the overall goal.
Yeah, Taryn, I love this conversation around omni-channel, and I certainly appreciate your perspective of it from both an early stage startup venture to companies that you were at that are much larger. I guess going back, at what stage or size of a company does a brand or company go omni-channel? Is it today in this world we need to do it immediately? I'm asking because startups that run lean are going to find it hard to spread finite resources across so many channels. And not only that, but just learn the complexity and depth of these channels. Amazon itself, we know very closely, is super hard to navigate if you're not in it day to day. So how does a lean startup balance that?
Yeah, totally. It's such a good question. I feel like everyone who listens to this is going to laugh at me for calling it omni-channel. It seems like such an old school term, but yeah, it's a really good question. My bias is to wait. And I would say most early stage companies try to take it on too quickly. And going back to what Laura said, like we didn't even touch on it yet, but like the back end operational complexities of moving from mono to multi is just, it's really sizable and has like big structural implications. It has accounting implications, it has tax implications, it has legal implications, it has tons of supply chain and logistics, implications. It has system infrastructure implications in terms of like needing to stand up EDI compliance and multi-channel inventory monitoring. And I mean, I could go on and on with this terribly unsexy list, but it really does foundationally infuse an exponential amount of complexity into an operating model and an operating structure. And I think oftentimes, like more than often, almost all the time, early stage businesses get understandably really excited about the opportunity and go like, well, what if we just did one pop-up? And it's like, well, actually one pop-up is in some ways structurally as much work as building out an entire retail fleet. Obviously very different from a capital expenditure perspective, but like operationally, those first 12 months, if you build one store or 5, it's really not that different. And so I am biased to really encourage early stage businesses to deeply study the complexity of that versus the ROI before venturing down that road. That being said, like I don't want to overconflate multi-channel as all being the same level of complexity. there are ways to dip your toe into exploring multi-channel distribution that are lighter lift, namely things like drop ship with a digital e-commerce partner, which could be an Amazon, probably less complex. You guys are experts there, not me, but a marketplace or a digital retailer in the space that might help you access an incremental audience is usually a lot less operationally complex than standing up your own bricks and mortar retail business or a business with like a major national offline retailer. And so I think there are shades of complexity within sort of the world of multi-channel expansion. But generally speaking, it does have a fundamental impact on how your entire business is structured from a complexity perspective.
Yeah, I was just gonna say and make a comment here, Laura. That's just a fantastic point about like drop shipping as another channel. That's super easy to implement. If you have an e-commerce D2C site, you could, take in additional products and catalog SKUs that way without much complexity. So great point there. And I really appreciate the perspective.
Yeah, I think like luckily there's so much good tooling out there in sort of the DTC landscape across Shopify and other players that allow for like much less complex, lighter lift digital integrations to begin to test. And that is a great way to sort of test into, okay, I'm going to take a haircut on the margin if I market my product on somebody else's site, but am I able to, access an incremental audience for cheaper? And so like looking at that whole ecosystem across, the acquisition funnel all the way through to sort of like the margin structure of your individual products and any sort of like operational costs associated with standing up that integration is sort of like how I would look at the analysis of whether or not this makes sense. But a digital first partnership will inevitably be a lot less complex. And the other nice thing about beginning to explore multi-channel that way is you can read results really quickly, right? Like it's so much longer lead to stand up either offline wholesale partnerships or build retail stores because you're having to outlay capital and resources, at best, at the shortest sort of like 6 months ahead of even seeing the beginning of any data. And so I think for early stage businesses that are still establishing kind of product market fit, who their audience is, what their DTC kind of overall business model unit economics look like, that's sort of oftentimes an easier way to begin to sort of spread your wings from a multi-channel or like incremental audience perspective. The other way too is, to think about partnerships that are either, I wrote a piece a few months ago for Adweek about this, like thinking about sort of like-minded brands and how you might be able to create strategic, limited time partnerships between one brand and another, where you sort of like, blast each other's respective email lists, et cetera, like do some kind of, content integration or social integration, et cetera, and begin to look at sort of partnerships maybe as like a baby step even before digital net new channel integration to see sort of experiment with that audience incrementality play.
That's a really good thought too. And I know a lot of brands will do collaborations on social, but I love the idea of expanding it even beyond that with email marketing and other opportunities. Now, I want to change gears a little bit on the topic because you've worked with so many high growth or hyper growth companies. And with that, sometimes it feels like you're running down the road while you're also trying to build the ship that is going to sail across the ocean once you get to the shore. And we also can somewhat relate. Like we're almost going to double our business this year, and there have definitely been those times where it feels like the kettle is going to pop because there's so much pressure and things are moving so quickly. And what are some mistakes to avoid during those high growth periods, and how can you make it a little less stressful during those high growth periods?
It's interesting. It's such an interesting like time in sort of the broader macro environment to be asking that question, because I think our answers candidly are are changing a little bit. I think we're all thinking about growth with maybe like a little bit more of a modulated or tempered mindset than we have been in the past. Maybe before I speak to that, I think what I would say first and foremost, and it sounds like a simple answer, but it's like actually I think operationally the hardest thing to do is just like maniacal prioritization and making sure that no matter what, you're continually revisiting that tech stack, like looking at, how you can ensure that, making sure that you can, ensure that maniacal prioritization is just practiced. And I think what happens is there's always creep, and it's really, really hard to balance kind of the ongoing tax of building your business and then taking on kind of the shininess of net new projects. And I think the trick there is in your prioritization process to make sure that you adequately weight the toll of just actually keeping the lights on for the business that you have built. And because there's always debt there, whether it's tech debt or operational debt or whatever it is. Like the child you have requires like food and sleep and water and love. And it's really easy to kind of look over to the other side and say, oh my gosh, we could do this partnership. We could launch this new product. We could add this feature. And those are all great things. But the mistake people make when they are building a prioritization process is they don't adequately weight the fact that they have this, forgive the analogy, as a mother, I'll give myself permission to say it, but like they have this child that like absolutely needs to be taken care of. And like they can't go and have 3 more and forget the one they have. So I think really like maniacal prioritization is critical. And I think in terms of growth, we've obviously lived, like going back to sort of the macro piece, like we've obviously lived through a time where not everybody, but there's been a lot of kind of growth at all cost mindset, which, I think having come from a more traditional retail background is always dangerous and almost never prudent. But that being said, I think hyper growth now will no longer be attractive to investors, acquirers, whomever, if it is at the cost of sort of overall unit or business model economics. And so those things don't have to happen at the same time. Growth can temporally run ahead of profit, obviously, and that happens, and investors know that and acquirers know that and whatever, but it can't come in the absence of any longer sort of tonally out there. And I think that's a really helpful correction because, I've said to some of my teams in the past, like, we're not in the nonprofit business. Like eventually you have to have business that profits. And so I think that the sort of mood out there, bringing that back to the center is not a bad thing at all for the long-term sustainability of early stage businesses persisting, well into the future.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. And actually you brought up something that's been a theme in some of our other shows as well. And something we talked about with Chris Gronkowski about how his business dramatically improved when he started focusing on his core business. Mm-hmm. That it's so easy as whether you're the business owner or you have very aggressive growth, revenue, or forecasted numbers that you need to hit, that there can be all of these shiny things, but just remaining in your lane and taking care of that first, getting it stable, and then adding on these incremental opportunities.
It's such a good point. And I think about it a lot in physical product businesses, right? You have to always nurture your hero product or, the castle kind of crumbles. And it's such a common mistake. And it's so easy to sort of run to the shiny next thing. And I think that's also the case with channels, right? Like you can easily tell yourself a tale if you're standing up, a retail business that's suddenly super productive and you're standing up a wholesale business that's, creating big slugs of revenue, big lumpy slugs of revenue to your top line. And, you take your eye off the prize of your own DTC business and suddenly like all your customers have traded into other channels and, your conversion is cut in half. And I think that's the case in terms of both product as well as channel. It's sort of like anything that's sort of part of that, the core of your business structurally need not be neglected. And I think, going back to my earlier point around prioritization, if you can always adequately weight your current business, your core business in your prioritization process that really helps to mitigate like getting off track there.
Yeah, this all sounds like just very good advice, notwithstanding macro conditions, really. And on that point about prioritization and really just focusing the business, how do you, and given your operational background, how do you, or what mistakes do you think early stage companies make most when it comes to SOPs and goal setting frameworks like OKRs or EOS? Is it not having them at all, or is it just not using them correctly? Or what do you generally see when it comes to like framing that prioritization?
I think two things. One is cadence and ownership, right? I would say cadence, ownership, and like practicality, right? Like OKRs should be grounded and like a derivative of big vision and long-term strategy, but they should be tactical and executable. They should ladder, right? They should make sense in terms of the long-term narrative, but they should be achievable and assignable to individual owners who can really take ownership of them and execute against them in a time frame that makes sense for a business, which in early stage is usually like 3 to 6 months. Like it's not even, I mean, I remember I used to think that like before I was in the startup world, like I was like, oh, we'll just build an annual plan. It's like an annual plan. That's like 10 years in startup world. So I think it's about making sure that from a strategic standpoint, OKRs really do cascade from where you're trying to get long term, but that the time frame in which they are centered is one that is shorter and executable. It's going to create real like P&L impact, and then that you can assign an owner to them. And that owner doesn't mean that's the only person contributing to the OKR, but that department head or that leader or that, subject matter expert, especially in a smaller organization, is the one who's going to kind of carry that flag all around the teams and get the help they need in order to get that thing shipped. And so to me, where companies go off course, and I see this a lot, is they fail to acknowledge that the OKR process is always imperfect, right? Everyone wants it to be so airtight, and it's just never airtight, but you're really managing to like 80%. You're trying to get like a B or a B plus on your OKR process. You're never going to get an A plus. And so what I see organizations do all the time is like they'll implement the process and then it'll be 80-85% effective. And then they go and redesign it. And they say like, okay, let's redo our OKRs. Let's redo when we do them. Let's redo how we do them. Let's redo how we measure them. And it's like, actually, all you're doing now is just taking an enormous step back. What you should do is like acknowledge that this process is kind of sticky and frustrating and imperfect, but it gets better through repetition and through like the organization just almost subconsciously understanding that process in their workflow. And that's the way to make it better, not to like every quarter try and rebuild the house.
Yeah, definitely. And if you're setting those OKRs and you're hitting every single one, then that should be recalculated, because you potentially set your goals a little too small.
Yeah, fair enough. And I think the other rub is like, should they be quantifiable or qualitative, and like, how do you really, and I think some of the nuance there is specific to companies. But going back to my point around maniacal prioritization, less OKRs and more measurable data-driven ones in general is always more effective. And I'm like is it left brain person? I'm much more comfortable in the world of like, oh, it's directionally right, and like, let's be super mission driven, and let's like, build the movement and beat the drum. And that's like the space I love to play in. But I've really taught myself over time to be much more quantifiably driven in the OKR process. I think one of the teams I've seen do it the best was at Mirror, where we just like were maniacal. It was like 3 OKRs every quarter with like 3 data points. And it was really easy to track where we were on and where we were off. It was just a real discipline around how reductive we were in the few data points that were going to really matter to each OKR. And it was not sort of a vanity exercise. It was a very clear roadmap. And that's, I think, when you get the most out of the process.
I think that's such a great point too, that sometimes these goals can be overly complicated, and that sometimes the hardest thing to do in business is to make it simple. so that the team actually follows through on tracking those metrics and reporting on those metrics. And it's something, actually, since we last collaborated on a project, we've implemented the concept of SMART goals for every single client, where we're building SMART goals for either a 30 to 180 day time period, because it's one thing to say, oh, we want to hit X number in revenue for this client, but there's so many steps that we need to accomplish in order to get there.
Yeah. And I think that's too where like people get a little spun out, is like the OKR or the SMART goal is not the to-do list, right? Then like the list of tasks in Asana or whatever you use to like PM the work product that underpins the goal, like that is the work you do intra-quarter, but keeping the North Star clear, I think helps keep that to-do list really narrow too.
Absolutely. Well, Todd, do you have any other final questions?
I do. Let me just finish with this one. I guess, with your latest role at IRL Partners, where you help startups grow, operate, acquire talent, do all of that, what executive guidance are you giving that just seems to be like boilerplate with each company you advise? And maybe something that you're just so tired of giving, like, geez, I wish companies would just realize this. Is there some advice that just seems to be given too often?
Such a good question. I think, and I have to give myself this advice a lot of times too, because I'm such a life project person. Like every startup we work with is like a child of mine. Like I fall in love with every project and I'm all in. I think it's and our structure as sort of like, fractional partners, fractional leaders helps with this, but it's really to sort of like zoom out and remember that it sounds so cliche, but it's a marathon, not a sprint. And I think like the cadence of startup world continually challenges founders' ability to have that more like modulated plotting approach. And it is actually where a lot of the long-term success is derived, is like, can you just stop and pause and take a breath and zoom out with me, and let's look out 12 months, let's look out 36 months. And that process takes a lot of discipline to do, but it's so effective in contextualizing near-term decisions. And I think oftentimes early stage businesses make imprudent short-term decisions based on like whatever factors are going on in that moment. And the real success happens when you can have the discipline to go through that exercise with a frequent cadence, because that it's like really easy advice to give. It's really hard advice to live by, and it really makes a difference.
I love that you brought this up, because we talk all the time about working on the business and not just in the business, whether that's for clients or even our own business. Like I've had periods, especially in the early ages of Envision Horizons, where I was so focused on growing our clients' businesses that I neglected our own focus of growth. And you're absolutely right. It's so much easier said than done. And I've even blocked out Friday mornings on my calendar once a month as a time where like no meetings, close out Slack to try and focus. And even then, it's so tempting to get caught up in things that are trying to catch my attention.
Yeah, it takes I love the on, not in. I think that's an amazing filter. I wrote that down. Yeah, I think it takes an enormous amount of discipline. For us, we do at IRL, we do quarterly offsites where we don't meet with any of our partner companies for 2.5 days. And it almost feels like self-care. It's like, oh my gosh, this is all about our company now. Amazing.
Well, we're doing our offsite in August, so I might have to catch up with you on some best practices there.
I love it. Of course.
Well, great. I think that is probably all the questions we have today. I would love to keep you on and pick your brain for hours, Taryn, but we all have things to do, and we generally appreciate you coming on today. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me. This is really fun.
Awesome. And just to close it out, Taryn, is there, for the listeners here today, is there, what's the best way that people can reach you or follow your content, whether that be social or LinkedIn? How can listeners get in touch with you?
Oh yeah, thank you. Yep, I'm on LinkedIn, Taryn Jones Laeben, and our website is irlpartners.co.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for coming on today, and it's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Talk to you soon. Appreciate it.
Advice.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Common Mistakes. If you're not yet subscribed, be sure to follow us and visit envisionhorizons.com to sign up for our weekly newsletter with all the latest Amazon news and expert advice. For Amazon sellers looking for more support, check out our Amazon brand management platform, My Horizons, and sign up for a free trial. Thanks for your support, and we'll see you on the next episode of Common Mistakes.